Welcome to episode 1 of my new series where I drink classic cocktails and talk about classic literature. I'm still workshopping a name for this. There's gotta be something like snappy and a little bit punny that would work. Like lit classics. Like lit as in literature and also like getting lit, except I'm not trying to get lit, I'm just trying to like enjoy a beverage while talking about books. Or like sips, classic lit. But that's like a slant rhyme. Classic tales and classic tales, where like the first tale is spelt like cocktail and the second tale is spelt like tale from a story. Tales and tales sounds a little bit zoological. I might need some guidance on this one. If you're new here, hello, my name is Carson. I love a deep bar shelf and an extensive bookshelf. I have a PhD in English literature. I have absolutely no professional qualifications when it comes to cocktails. I'm just an enthusiast. And I thought I would take these two interests of mine and put them together and start drinking my way through the International Bartenders Association official list of classic cocktails while also talking my way through the literary canon of classics. One part classic, one part lit. That could be a name for the series. And for my first installment of the series, rather than talking about a piece of classic literature, I thought I would talk about an essay about classic literature that I really love. Why Read the Classics by Italo Calvino, first published in the 1980s. Italo Calvino is an author whose fiction I definitely plan to talk about during this series. He has one book in particular that is a favorite classic of mine. And in this essay, he's talking not just about that title question, why read the classics, but he's breaking down the idea of a classic and questioning how we define classic literature. The essay is quite short, as you can see. This is the whole thing. It's formatted as 14 points. And in this video, I'm going to talk about this essay point by point and dig into this question of what constitutes a classic and what the purpose of reading classic literature is. But first, I'm going to make myself a drink. I'm going to start the series off with just like one of the most classic cocktails there is, an old-fashioned. Got my glass with my sugar cube in it, going to put a few dashes of bitters in and a little bit of water and give that a little bit of a crunchy crush. A fork is not the right tool for this job, but like I said, I'm not a professional. I'm just an enthusiast. In goes the ice cube, and then the whiskey, which the IBA says that you can use either bourbon or rye for this. I like it with rye because I find that bourbon is already on the sweet side, and since this drink is basically just sweetened whiskey, I want something that'll balance it out a little bit more. I'm also just now realizing that I forgot to bring in any kind of measuring implement for my whiskey. But whatever. Perfect. My approach to making this classic cocktail is also a preview of my approach to classic literature, which is, you know, a little bit permissive, a little bit flexible. Italo Calvino and I both think that there's no need to adhere too strictly to a rigid definition. Give my cocktail a little stir, and the last step is just to add a little garnish. I made my own cocktail cherries. These are just fresh cherries that I hand pitted with a chopstick, and yes, I do want you to be impressed by that. And then I soaked in a mixture of some homemade syrup and brandy and maraschino liqueur. An old-fashioned. Tastes right to me. Now let's get into our essay. As I mentioned, in this essay, Calvino is working through not just the title question of why read the classics, but also what is a classic. If you are willing, I would love to hear your thoughts on this both before and after you have heard what Calvino has to say on the subject. You could pause the video at this point and take a minute to reflect on these two questions, what is a classic and why read the classics, and share with us in the comments what your initial answers on your own are, and then also after you've watched the video or after you've just read Calvino's essay on your own, you can let us know whether your answers and your feelings on the subject overlap at all with what Calvino has to say or whether you went in a different direction. It's definitely a subjective matter. You know, there's no International Literature Scholars Association that can make a definitive list of what the classics are the way that the IBA has done with cocktails. And I mean, probably there are people who disagree with the IBA's list of cocktails. I don't even know what their methodology is. I just seized on it as a convenient list of classic cocktails. Anyway, when it comes to what constitutes classic literature, and what the purpose of reading these literary classics are going to be, everyone is going to have a slightly different perspective informed by their own experiences and views generally. So let's get into Calvino's. Starting with number 1. The classics are those books about which you usually hear people saying, "I'm rereading," never "I'm reading." At least this is the case with those people whom one presumes are well-read. It does not apply to the young, since they are at an age when their contact with the world and with the classics which are part of that world is important precisely because it is their first such contact. This reminds me right away about how much I love Calvino's views on this subject, which, spoiler, I agree with almost everything he says in this. I think it's a fair point that classics are novels which are frequently reread, and I like that he's acknowledging the benefit of a mature perspective on literature. But he's also emphasizing what a gift it is to read something with fresh eyes, the importance of a youthful first impression of literature. And even though he kicks off his work of defining what a classic is by referencing the experience of rereading something as an adult with a mature perspective, he also acknowledges that it is joyful and valuable to read something for the first time as an adult, to get around to a classic that you always hear people say, "I'm rereading," that you are now reading for the first time. He's identifying these 3 stages of reading and rereading tied to a person's age and maturity. You know, there's a certain value in reading a classic for the first time as a young person. There's a certain value in rereading it as an adult, and even in reading something for the first time as an adult. I find that to be true from my own experience. You know, I've had all those forms of contact with literary classics. You know, there are books that I'm very glad I read as a young person because I absorbed something from them and they were formative to me in some way, but there are also classics that I've read very recently as a fully formed adult that I have gotten a particular pleasure from reading in that way. I recently read The Age of Innocence for the first time, and I think that that book emotionally gut-punched me as a 32-year-old in a way that it would not have done if I had read it when I was 17. He moves on then to a second potential way to define a classic. The classics are those books which constitute a treasured experience for those who have read and loved them, but they remain just as rich in experience for those who reserve the chance to read them for when they are in the best condition to enjoy them. The best condition to enjoy them. He's really emphasizing the personal nature of reading and how sometimes you kind of encounter a book at the moment that is right for you. You know, to talk again from personal experience of reading the classics, I read Persuasion for the first time when I was probably 17, when it was assigned to me in a high school class, and I absolutely hated it. I thought it was so stupid and so boring because, as he says in this second point, the reading we do when young can often be of little value because we are impatient, cannot concentrate, lack expertise in how to read, or lack experience in life. I think definitely my lack of experience in reading and life when I was 17 meant that I just was not in a position to connect with Persuasion. I didn't get the humor, I didn't get the subtleties of it in the way that I did then when I read it in my 20s. And now Persuasion is in my top 3 Austen novels. I love it. In fact, now when I read it, I sometimes remember the experience of reading it as a 17-year-old and how particular passages I was rolling my eyes at and thought they were so stupid and boring. And now those are the passages that I recognize as really quite funny. Based on these first 2 points, Calvino then moves on to a third one, which again is connected to how age and experience and the experience of rereading shapes one's understanding of a classic. The classics are books which exercise a particular influence, both when they imprint themselves on our imagination as unforgettable and when they hide in the layers of memory disguised as the individual's or the collective unconscious. We're getting now into the idea of influence, both on the individual and on society and culture and literary tradition. I love that phrasing he uses, talking about the influence of a book that can hide in layers of memory disguised as the individual's unconscious. Fittingly enough, I no longer remember when I read this for the first time or how I reacted to it the first time, but every time I return to it, I feel like I am reading my own thoughts mirrored back to me. And I know that realistically, that's because I read this and it made such a strong impression on me that then these things that Calvino is saying hid themselves in my memory as if they were my own thoughts. After working through these first 3 points, Calvino says, okay, so rereading versus reading actually isn't the most important metric for defining a classic. He then goes through 3 more successive points without really any elaboration. Number 4, a classic is a book which with each rereading offers as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. Yes, agreed. Number 5, a classic is a book which even when we read it for the first time gives the sense of rereading something we have read before. Again, I agree. Not always. I don't think that's always the case, but I think that that does bear out in many classics. I think especially with like Shakespeare, when people read a Shakespeare play for the first time or watch a play in performance, they have that sense of familiarity, even though it's new to them, of recognizing phrases or plots or just feeling like they've seen references to this before. It's familiar even when you encounter it for the first time. And number 6, a classic is a book which has never exhausted all it has to say to its readers. From here, he moves on to his 7th point, which he does spend quite a bit of time elaborating on and fleshing out. Number 7, the classics are those books which come to us bearing the aura of previous interpretations and trailing behind them the traces they have left in the culture or cultures, or just in the languages and customs through which they have passed. Here, Calvino is expanding more on that point of influence, which I do think is a necessary part of defining a classic. Classics are books that have these kind of ripple effects that once they are published start influencing other literature and just people and cultures and conversations. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think this is also illustrative of how something can be a classic of a particular genre or a classic for a particular country or a particular culture because they exert influence in that genre, that culture, that country. You know, you can have Chinese classics that Western readers have never heard of, but they exerted a significant influence in Chinese culture and writing and literary traditions. You can have a Gothic classic that influenced a lot of Gothic literature that followed, but that doesn't get read broadly or taught in just general literature courses. You can have a queer literary classic that is very famous for a particular subset of people, but not widely known outside of that. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Back into the Calvino. In his discussion about influence and how classics bear the aura of previous interpretations, Calvino goes on to say that as much as possible, one should avoid learning what those other interpretations are when going into reading a classic for the first time. A reader should try to engage with as little scholarship, as little commentary, even as little discussion amongst other individual readers who have previously read this book before reading a classic. Calvino goes on to say, the introduction, critical apparatus, and bibliography are used like a smoke screen to conceal what the text has to say, and what it can say only if it is left to speak without intermediaries who claim to know more than the text itself. From that statement, he transitions into point number 8. A classic is a work which constantly generates a pulviscular cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off. Pulviscular, delicious. Now, obviously, I value literary scholarship. I do literary scholarship to some extent, not in a very formal way, and certainly not in a writing critical introductions to bibliographies way, but if I believed very strongly that no one should be exposed to critical context or personal commentary of a classic before reading that classic, then I'd probably have to take this whole channel down, If I was going to promote the idea that classics should be able to shake off the particles of obfuscating scholarship and commentary, then one of those particles would be me. But as much as I value literary scholarship, I really value what he's saying here, and I think it is necessary. In fact, I'm gonna sip on this old-fashioned and go on a little bit of a rant here perhaps, but I think that this is one of the big problems in the way that classic literature is taught, that it's taught and talked about by people within academic institutions as this thing that can only be understood by experts, and it's safeguarded, gate-kept as something that you need help to understand, and the universities will be the ones to help you. And obviously, I went through academia, I went through the university system. I found an immense value in that. It shaped the way I read, mostly for the better. I do feel like I'm still recovering from some of the less positive elements of how that influenced my reading habits and expectations for myself. But I think that as much benefit as I got out of reading classic literature in a formal academic setting, ultimately what is more important is maintaining the truth that all you need to understand literature is to read it and connect with it. And anybody can do that, regardless of your educational background or your age or any personal identifying factors about yourself. The only thing you need to understand literature is to read it. That's it. On to point number 9. Classics are books which, the more we think we know them through hearsay, the more original, unexpected, and innovative we find them when we actually read them. In his elaboration on this point, Calvino introduces another piece of the puzzle of defining classics that I really love, which is that every individual reader will have a different set of books that to them are classic. He says that this whole point about how classics will always feel innovative and will always surprise you when you read them for the first time happens when a classic text works as a classic. That is, when it establishes a personal relationship with the reader. If there is no spark, the exercise is pointless. It is no use reading classics out of a sense of duty or respect. We should only read them for love. You can see that we're starting to transition now away from what is a classic and into more focus on why read the classics. And part of that reason to read the classics is love and honoring the partiality, the subjectivity of literature. There's no point in reading a classic out of a sense of obligation. You have to enjoy it. There has to be a spark. He does acknowledge here that the exception to this rule is school. Sometimes you have to read books that you don't feel a spark with because it's part of your education. My personal illustration of this point is James Joyce's Ulysses. I read it for school twice, and I hated it both times. I read it because it was assigned to me, and I discussed it, and I even wrote a couple papers about it, and I hated it. And then I tried to read it again outside of school, and there was no spark. I didn't hate it, I didn't resent it, I could appreciate parts of it, but it just is not a book that is for me. So I'm not gonna read it when it comes to my, what Calvino calls unenforced reading, my personal reading, my pleasure reading. Calvino, again, acknowledges the importance of enforced reading for school, but says that it is only through unenforced reading that you will discover the books that you truly love, the books that are your books. If we go down this road, he then says, we arrive at an idea of a classic which is very lofty and demanding. Number 10. A classic is the term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe, a book on par with an ancient talisman. This gets back to an idea that he has already touched on briefly before, which is that a classic is an inexhaustible resource. That's how I understand this lofty idea that a classic is a book that represents the whole of the universe. It's a book that whatever you bring to it, you get something from it. However many times you read it, you discover something new. And in elaborating on this point, he goes on to say that the book that does that for you, the book that you love and that serves as this personal talisman that represents the whole of the universe, isn't necessarily going to be a book that you wholly and unproblematically love. There might be an element of friction and almost of antagonism to your relationship with this kind of classic. He references his own relationship to the writings of Rousseau. He says, "All of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's thoughts and actions are dear to me, but they all arouse in me an irrepressible urge to contradict, criticize, and argue with him." I absolutely relate to this. I mean, I've talked before on this channel about my relationship with Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew and how in some ways I love it because it was very formative for me to read. Speaking of reading classics at a young age, I read that when I was about 13 years old. But I also, in a very real way, hate that book and want to fight William Shakespeare over that play. And that urge to push back and contradict and to keep on rereading to better understand your complicated feelings about a book are part of what Calvino is identifying as a valuable quality of a classic. I certainly feel that way also about the works of John Milton and Paradise Lost in particular. And this brings us to, or brings me at least, to point number 11. Your classic is a book to which you cannot remain indifferent and which helps you define yourself in relation or even in opposition to it. Your classic, he says, and he puts your in quotes, which I take to mean that your classic is one not only which is a book that you personally identify as a classic, but a book that in some way belongs to you. It is yours because it's kind of part of you. You cannot remain indifferent to it, and you understand yourself through it, even if that understanding is based on an oppositional relationship to the text. Again, this to me connects with Paradise Lost, a text which I love very dearly, which I am never indifferent to, but which sometimes makes me very angry, particularly in Milton's representation of Eve, a representation which is fundamentally misogynistic. It occasionally infuriates me, but the feeling of being infuriated is certainly not a feeling of indifference. We then move on to point number 12. A classic is a work that comes before other classics, but those who have read other classics first immediately recognize its place in the genealogy of classic works. I really like this idea of a genealogy of literature, and actually this probably illustrates yet again the fact that this piece of writing is one that has hidden in my mind and disguised itself as one of my own thoughts, because this is definitely something that I talk about when I talk about literature. I know in my Mad Woman in the Attic video that I made earlier this year, I talked about the idea that there is a kind of genealogy or a messy family tree of some kind among books like Jane Eyre and The Wide Sargasso Sea and Rebecca and others. Enthusiastic as I am about this idea of a genealogy of literature, I am even more enthusiastic about what Calvino says following this, which is, "At this point, I can no longer postpone the crucial problem of how to relate the reading of classics to the reading of all the other texts which are not classics." How do we balance the reading of classics with the reading of not classics? Calvino says this is a problem which is linked to questions like why read the classics instead of reading works which will give us a deeper understanding of our own times, and where can we find the time and the ease of mind to read the classics, inundated as we are by the flood of printed material about the present. I feel like often you see people jumping to one or the other polarity of opinion on this subject. People either saying, classics are the best literature, they are the only literature that I think is worth reading, or you see people saying, why would I waste my time reading classics that have nothing to do with me? I would rather read contemporary stuff. I certainly don't hold either one of those two opinions. I think I come somewhat smack in the middle of them, more smack in the middle than Calvino does. But in his continued discussion of this idea, Calvino is acknowledging that it is impossible to read all classics all the time. And he says not only is it unrealistic to imagine that a person could spend all their reading time exclusively reading venerated literary classics, but that even if it were possible to do that, even if one never read contemporary fiction, and in fact never read so much as a magazine, that it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. And that even if you want to prioritize the reading of classics, you will actually end up with a deeper and more substantial understanding of those literary classics if you are also reading contemporary writing. Calvino says, the contemporary world may be banal and stultifying, but it is always the context in which we have to place ourselves to look either backwards or forwards. In order to read the classics, you have to establish where exactly you are reading them from. Otherwise, both the reader and the text tend to drift in a timeless haze. I'm not 100% on board with the framing of the contemporary world as banal and stultifying, but I definitely do agree with Calvino's argument that you have to be able to balance reading the classics with reading works published within your own time. In his final 2 points, Calvino continues to talk about this balance between contemporary and classic. Number 13, a classic is a work which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, which at the same time the classics cannot exist without. And number 14, a classic is a work which persists as background noise even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway. I like that he's not saying anything so simple as classic literature is timeless. He's saying that classic literature is of its time, readers are of their time, but a classic is able to both capture your attention in a way that it is all you hear and the rest of the world kind of falls away, and also to get into, again, this idea of influence and cultural impact. A classic is something that is there in the background even when you're not reading it. That a classic is something that persists. That takes us through all 14 of Calvino's points in this essay, but he closes with a couple more comments that just really bring it home for me. When I was talking earlier about the idea that something can be a classic only in a limited context, I said I was getting ahead of myself because I recognized that I was starting to talk around one of the ideas that Calvino mentions in his conclusion, which is this. All that can be done is for each one of us to invent our own ideal library of our classics. And I would say that one half of it should consist of books we have read and that have meant something to us, and the other half of books which we intend to read and which we suppose might mean something to us. Maybe I just like this sentiment because he's saying that your library should be 50-50 of books that you have read and books that you hope to read, and that makes me feel better about buying books way more quickly than I can read them. It's what Italo Calvino would do. But more substantially, more seriously, I love the idea that everybody has their own personal library of classics. That because reading is so deeply personal, my own grouping of classic literature will be different than every other person's reading this. And that's how it should be. It's not that one of us has the correct perspective on what constitutes classic literature and what the classics are. It's that each one of us has different books that are meaningful to us and are classic to us. Ultimately, in answer to this overarching question of why read the classics, Calvino says, reading the classics is always better than not reading them. Reading the classics is an end unto itself. It's not that you should expect to get something from it. It's not an investment of I put this in and then I get this as a reward. It's just that reading them is a joy and a pleasure, and yes, sometimes a benefit, but an intangible one and an unreliable one because our relationships with classics are so personal and individual, and because there has to be that spark and that love in order for a classic to be worth reading. And he ends, and these are his final sentence, by illustrating this point that reading them is better than not reading them. He says, when the hemlock was being prepared, Socrates was learning a melody on the flute. "What use will that be to you?" he was asked. "At least I will learn this melody before I die." Maybe it's the rye whiskey, but that got me a little bit sentimental. That hit for me. I fucking love this essay. This final section of the essay really is one of my favorite parts of it. I love that Calvino spends all this time really digging into the idea of how to define a classic, why to read a classic, all these different ways that you can unravel these threads, but that he ultimately concludes that each individual reader just has to build their own library. While rereading this, I've been working on compiling my own list of what would go in my library, trying to keep it that 50-50 split of books that I have read and that have meant something to me, and books that I hope to read and hope will mean something to me. I've been, as I said, making a list. I'll link that list in the description for this video, but ultimately the compiling of that personal library of classics is the work of a lifetime. And what an exciting thing that is. As I go through this series that I'm starting off of drinking the classics, why drink the classics? That could be the name of the series. As I go through it, I will be primarily referencing books that I have read before and already have a relationship with, but also getting to some of the books in my library of classics I'm compiling that I haven't yet read and that I hope will mean something to me. I hope you will share your own thoughts in the comments on what constitutes a classic and your own answer to the question of why read the classics, and if you substantially agree or disagree with Calvino. And share, please, also some of the titles that belong in your personal library of classics. And cheers. I used to wake up bright and early, got my work done quickly, held my baby tightly. Oh my God, that cherry is boozier than the booze. Damn. I feel like I just took a shot. Woo!